from many people for years. And I've tried to resist writing a book because I always felt I must write a book when I'm ready. But I find most things you're not really ready until you decide to be ready, right? And so, and there's many books actually that I know I'm going to write. Quite a lot. Probably the next, and I promise in the book. I keep promising I'm going to write another book, and this is a story for a different day. But Uzile is a 13-year-old now, Mchana of mine. My sister, the youngest in the family, my sister's daughter. She is a bit of a genius. She's not a normal 13-year-old, you know. She is the champion of the spelling bee.
Yes, I saw that.
Defended twice, and then now she's decided she's not entering this year. She'll enter when she's in high school. And I wanted to use Uzile for this because I wanted to demonstrate how simple the book is. And at some stage I wasn't convinced myself that it's simple enough, because the ILO as an institution and the United Nations as a family of the ILO and the sort of the mother body of the multilateral environment is a very complex environment. It's not an easy environment. And having been fortunate to be at the ILO and at the UN proper, because I also was the chairman of the policy working group for business and human rights. That's what took me to Coca-Cola in Atlanta. So I used to chair those conversations for business and human rights together with, I would be the host, hosting the head of the United Nations Human Rights Committee, Madame Bachelet, who used to be the president of Chile. So because I knew both organizations and how complex and sophisticated, not sophisticated is not the right word, complex and technical, I then thought Uzile would add a different touch. And so Uzile is one of 7 forward writers in the book.
Oh, yes.
So there's 7 forward writers. Yeah.
Yeah, I did go through them also.
Yes.
I couldn't wait to get to the actual book.
The meat.
Yeah. And then ended so quickly, and hey, season 2 again. So I mean, because what we wanted to do here is to bring it home. Yes, if you want to know about the International Labour Organization, you can. I don't know if it's by coincidence or by design. And the first time you came here, you said things don't happen by accident. And that's how we got to engage and chat. And today you can see there's also wines as part of decoration in the 3 food. You want
Like 3 food.
Clearly.
Okay, well.
It's some powerful symbolism from what you try and capture here.
Yeah.
To say 340 has tripartitism.
Yes, the 3-legged pot.
Yeah.
For me, whenever I spoke in the ILO, although I must say one of the reasons I used to do that was to also demonstrate to the Europeans that we don't only need symbolism from them. For me, it was a message for them, and I always went out of my way to think of messaging and symbolism from home, from South Africa, from Africa, because it's a very Eurocentric world. So that was one of the reasons. So when I was thinking about what captures the ILO the best in symbolism, I thought the 3-legged pot, because it's got 3 constituencies. Those 3 constituencies are meant to be equal. They are not in reality. We can go into that when you want to. So you've got the trade unions, you've got the governments, and you've got the employers' organizations. And those 3 legs I used to explain. I said, you know, if you're cooking an ancestral feast, and you can imagine the response by Europeans, like ancestors, what are these ancestors? You would be having a problem if those 3 legs are not firm, because you run the danger and the risk of having the food spilt, and should the food be spilt, it might mess up the ancestral feast.
I think let's go in there, because I made some notes about it. We don't want to go. So I'll start first by saying, so what the other interesting thing, just on the pictures and the people that you were with, Kimang, that lady, Sharon Baro.
Yes.
So I was also a unionist, if you want to call it. I was at the 2012 COSATU Congress as a delegate. So I want us to get into that part. We'll get onto that part of conferencism, conference, the notion of conferencing, having 5,000 people and yet only 500 people contribute and direct. So, but on the three-legged fool is even, it's balanced. And I'll start by saying, while you were the vice chair of the
ILO,
vice president of
the IOE,
the employers. While I was in COSATU, I'm mentioning this deliberately because you know when you if you are seen to be in cahoots with the employer, you're a sellout. And how do you find a balance of being one of the first black representative,
first African as opposed to black?
Okay, yes.
Yeah.
But also that's also important because it means my take and what I'm trying to get from you also to contributors, they sanitize what they use a face of struggle, if you want, or a continent of struggle and of less industrialization and less equality in terms of employer-employee relations and less rights. And it could be two ways. It could be to sanitize or to say you are the best voice to say what are the plights and how can you employers deal with trade unions.
True.
So how was the relationship with trade unions? And I'll get to the South Africa. We'll come back to South Africa.
Okay, so let's start with the photo. The photo with Sharon Barrows. It was in Mendoza, Argentina, over a glass of wine. Sharon Barrows, Errol Keresepi. It was in Mendoza. Mendoza is a very good wine region in Argentina. That's where they make good wines. Sharon Barrows hates me.
Oh.
Cannot stand me. So this photo is acting. You know, I think I needed to say that. It's important because it has an impact later in life, which was confirmed to me only 3 weeks ago by another trade unionist. Yes, 3 weeks ago. This trade unionist lady told me. In fact, she was on Zoom with me. She says, "Are we recording?" I said, "No." She said, "Please make sure, I want to tell you something." Then I said, "Yes." She said, "Well, the reason you were sabotaged from being the DG of the ILO was because we had a meeting. So my name was already accepted by the whole of Africa. It was in the African Union. Sharon Barrows got in touch with them and said, you can have anybody but him."
Please hold that one.
Okay, so I wanted to tell you that. Okay, so let me leave it and go back. So I just want to tell you about Sharon Barrows.
Interesting.
But on the sanitization part, and you make very valid points because when I got into the ILO around about 2008, 2009, and I didn't know what was happening. It was quite interesting because I was like trying to figure out what happens here, you know, because you've got those big plenary rooms, right? So you've got your employers on the right, you've got your governments in the middle, and you've got the trade unions on the left. And so you go into working committee arrangements, and then after that you go and debate these things in plenary. And if your employer representative, the person who was my leader in the conversation at the time, because you know there's spokespersons for conversations and the spokespersons for the whole institution, right? So if your spokesperson in the conversation does not agree with you, that was my biggest moment of how to work the ILO, was that I tried to say something in the workshop for employers. And the lady who was my spokesperson from Germany would not take it. And it was important for us. It was about technology and water and sustainability, and how we, the whole world, must find a way of ensuring that there's universal coverage and whatever. So, and I felt strongly that Africa needs to show up there. She ignored me. So we then went into the plenary. And when we got to the plenary, I asked people, how do you get your contribution to be in there when it's been kicked out of your own group? Because you're supposed to come as a group with a unified voice and fight against the other groups for their positions, right? Cut a long story short, I then discovered that what you need to do is to get someone else, preferably from government, to come up with an alternative position.
Okay.
So I then literally went to the Caribbean, I went to Nigeria, I went to Ghana, I went to Uganda, and I asked them, and the guys were saying, but we don't know how to say what you're asking. I said, I'll write it for you. No, I said, I'll write it for you. So I actually wrote the statement, and I left it there, and I went to my group, right? And then as the conversation was happening, especially when it gets to that page for the amendments, a guy from Nigeria raised his hand, and he said, we just want to raise this point. I'll never forget the look I got from my spokesperson. She worked it out, because she turned around and she looked, and I kept a very blank face. I just looked as if nothing had happened. And from that day, I realized that this is a place where it's about games. You know, we're dealing with people's lives, but it's games. Right? It's a matter of who can play the game the best.
Sure.
And to play the game the best, you need to understand the rules of engagement and the board that the game is played on. And in terms of how you then cross that with the trade unions and whatever you, my coming into a position was through a Colombian who I mentioned in my book died from cancer, Alberto Echevarria. Yeah? Yeah, Echevarria. So he's the one who asked me to be involved. And how I actually believe I gained the trade unions kind of trust was when the whole of the United Nations, now not the ILO, the whole of the United Nations, and that's not in the book, because it's in my next book, reduced all the salaries of all the employees of the United Nations. So WTO, WHO, UNPD, whatever, they reduce all the salaries. And how they do that is they do a test in New York and a test in Geneva for a standard of living.
Okay.
If New York and Geneva say the standard of living has gone up, the salaries go up.
Okay.
If they say standard of living has gone down, salaries go down, and they're slashed. This is, you agree to this, by the way, before you work for the United Nations.
Sure.
Except in this particular instance, the entity that is charged, they outsource this role to an entity that is charged with actually doing this study and this research, used a flawed methodology to do it. And there were 63 flaws in it. But when it came into the ILO, it had already been cooked. So one of the things I like to say is that all the decisions in the ILO are made in the United Nations, and the ILO are made in the corridors, not in the room. So it had already been cooked outside the rooms, that this is what is going to be sold inside the room. And I stood for against this. They'd already decided. The trade unions threw their employers under the bus. The staff union of the ILO has about 1,300, 1,350 workers.
Okay.
The staff union was fighting this because all the United Nations family of organizations were looking to the ILO to be the last stand to fight this. Because for obvious reasons, we are the ones that deal with the rights of workers. But the trade unions, together with the DG, as he then was, and the government, had already cooked it. So when I opposed it, they gavelled and made a ruling without voting. I tried to raise my hand and they ignored me. And then I stood up, and I stood up because I was angry, not because I was trying to do it. I was just trying to think that if I speak at that moment, I might say something wrong. So I stood up, and then I tried to figure out what do I do next. And then I walked out of the room. I'm told that it was the first time ever that an employer representative walked out of a room. It's a trade union thing, not an employer.
Yeah.
And when I walked out, all the employer leaders of the world, now behind me sits the leaders of the German people, the leaders of the American people, the leaders of the Brazilian people, and so on and so on, at the back, presidents of business organizations. And I realized as I walked that, my God, I didn't consult. Now, you don't do anything without consulting in the ILO. Everything is consultation. I should have sent a note to somebody at the back or a WhatsApp to somebody at the back to say, I'm about to walk out. What do you think? Right? But I didn't have time to think, so I walked out. When I walked out, they all walked out. They followed me out. And I'll never forget this young lady from the trade union, from the staff union. She was actually the Secretary General of the staff union. Okay, so the room was full, maybe capacity, probably there must have been about 1,000 people in the room, seated. But there were about maybe 300, 400 workers who were picketing inside the room. So every time somebody spoke against workers, they would flip their paper, they would go, shh, 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 you know, and then the one guy would say, let's have parliamentary talk, let's have parliamentary behavior, then they would keep quiet, right? And so now they've gavelled that the salaries will be cut. And I was fighting that salaries cannot be cut, and I was giving arguments for why salaries should not be cut because of these flaws. This lady came running to me to the door, and then she stood, she was actually Spanish, she couldn't speak English that well, but she said, sir, you are leaving the room for us. And I remember thinking, I'm not leaving the room for you. I'm leaving the room for me, for my sanity, because I'm thinking, I'm going to do something very bad here. So I need to leave. So we went out, and when we went out, as we are walking to our room, because we have to walk to our caucus room. Now remember, everything in the ILO is done in 3 languages, right? Everything is 3. So it's English, French, Spanish. But all the other countries, except for Africa, this is another problem you can note if you want. Africa does not have an African language in the ILO. The Japanese have their translator, the Chinese have their translator. Whoever you are, you have a translator, but not us. So now we're walking to the caucus room, and the one guy next to me says to me, thank you, thank you. I said, thank you for what? Because I'm still trying to process how am I going to explain myself to the caucus. I've just walked out. I've done something that's never been done in the ILO. I'm thinking, I don't think anybody's ever done something like this. And this guy says to me, thank you. So I said, thank you for what? In fact, he said, merci beaucoup. So I said, merci beaucoup, pourquoi? So he says, because you've done something that should have been done a long time here. These are hypocrites, these people. They are hypocrites, these people. They pretend they love people, they love workers, but actually they love themselves. He says, I'm retiring. I don't have to be nice to you because I'm retiring next month. In case you think I'm just licking your ass. He says, this should have been done a long time ago. So we get to the caucus room, and when we get to the caucus room, I mean, I still remember my room, where everybody sits, Spain, Germany, China, Japan, whatever, Congo, Nigeria. But now there's no translation.
Oh, so human
traduction is translation. It's not because we did not plan to have a break. Right? So now we're sitting there, and that day I discovered all these people can speak English.
Wow.
Yeah, but and for me that's powerful. Because they refuse to speak English and insist on their languages being spoken. We're the only nation, continent, where we want to please other people by speaking a language that's not ours. You don't speak your Xhosa and your Zulu and Sesotho and Sepedi or Setswana. We have to speak a language that makes us feel we belong. Right? These guys, that day, I was looking, so they all spoke English. They said, whatever you do, you never apologize. Don't apologize. We'll go back there, and when we get to that room, you just say, I'm very disappointed that in a house of dialogue and social dialogue, this happened today, and then you keep quiet, and then you say next point. But when we came out, and I'm sorry, I've got to explain this because you asked, but the only way to explain it is long. So we're now coming out of the caucus room. We're going back. It was the second last day of the deliberations, right? And so we're going back, and as we go back to the GB room now, the governing body room, on the left is the caucus room of the workers, or when the workers normally would be. And as we're walking, so I'm walking with my teams, and everybody says, today we want to walk next to you. We had nothing to do with your decision, but we want people to know we're with you. So we're walking, and then somebody comes rushing and says, he's here, he's here, he's here. So they come out. It was the staff union.
Okay.
800 members of the staff union rush out, and they lift me. And the employers don't know what to do. This is not done with employers. In Africa, we know with toy, but with them, it's like, what's happening? So they raise me, and these guys are standing there, and the president of the staff union, who is in the photos as well, this lady, president of the Catherine Comte Tibergin, she says to me in my ear, she says, they will never lie to us again about you.
Oh, so it's been happening.
We know you now. And then she said to me, when you get into the room, speak whatever you want to say very quickly. We are telling you and nobody else that there is a strike, a protest starting immediately. We're going to switch off all the mics. There won't be transmission for the whole house. So we went in, I spoke, I finished speaking, the mic switched off. And one of the ladies on that says, there's no translation. And they said the strike starts now.
Oh yes.
Yeah, so that's the story I can give you.
So that's how you got to stand on the side of employees or workers using the strength of employers or your position as a vice chair.
And the COSATU guy, who I discovered 3 weeks is part of the plot.
No, I'm coming to that story.
But I won't mention his name. I won't mention his name.
I'm coming
He
will
comes to
mention.
me. No, okay, you can mention his name, but he comes to me and he says to me, oh, shop steward. He calls me a shop steward.
all of a sudden.
Yeah, he says, oh, shop steward. I looked at him and thought, what is this man's mad? What's wrong with him? You know, because he failed in doing his work on the left side of the room, where they should have been the ones fighting against this.
So we will bring it home